The first thing Selim did when he came to power was reconfirm all the treaties that the Ottomans had with the states in Europe, thereby keeping his western border safe and sound. He then had to follow up on the narrative that brought him to power, which was to deal with the Safavid Shah. Now the Ottomans would be attacking a fellow Muslim empire, which is generally frowned upon under Islamic law, but the religious clergy gave him the backing to do so because they saw the Safavids as a threat to Deen and Devlet, but also the Safavids had caused internal problems by stirring up the Shah Kulu rebellion. In 1514, Selim marched his army of 100,000 soldiers east to meet the Shah, who had 50,000 soldiers of his own. They met at a place called Chaldiran, which is on the border between the two empires, and Shah Ismail was very, very confident because he defeated all comers in his route to becoming the overall leader of Persia. He also thought he was the Messiah and therefore couldn't be beaten, and for that reason he started the battle with a full-on charge with his cavalry and his infantry armed with just swords. This was met by cannon fire from Selim and they were obliterated, followed up by a janissary charge, and within a few hours the matter had been concluded. Selim had won a stunning victory. The Shah had to flee, and it is said he lived the last 10 years of his life in a very withdrawn manner. This was the first encounter with the Safavids, but it certainly would not be the last. Prior to the Battle of Chaldiran, the Shah in Persia had made an alliance with the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, a Sunni dynasty, and he'd also tried to send messages via Mamluk Egypt to Europe so that the Ottomans would have enemies on two fronts. All this made Selim realize that the Mamluks were a hostile entity to his empire. So in 1516 he marched his army through Anatolia and into Mamluk-controlled Syria, where he met them at the Battle of Marj Dabiq, and which was near Aleppo in the north of Syria, and a carbon copy of the Battle of Chaldiran ensued. The Mamluks charged with their infantry and their foot soldiers, and Selim returned with cannon fire, and the result was the same. The Mamluk Sultan died in the battle, and the Mamluks fled back to Egypt, which allowed Selim to occupy Damascus. Selim offered the Mamluks to become his vassals, but the Mamluks were the people who had defeated the Mongols. So for them to give up without a fight was simply just not in their DNA. So they flat out rejected this. So Selim decided to pass on through Palestine past Jerusalem. If the Safavid campaign was one of necessity, then the Mamluk campaign was one of great opportunity. If he could take Egypt, the political, military, economic, material and spiritual benefits would be immense. He arrived outside Al-Qahira, Cairo, and the most important Arab center in the Middle East, and he managed to defeat the Mamluks on the outskirts of Cairo very, very easily. Now Selim had integrated the heartland, the traditional heartland of the Muslim world, into his rapidly growing empire. 250 years prior to Selim taking Cairo from the Mamluks, the Mongols had invaded the Muslim world and completely ransacked the city of Baghdad and killed the last Abbasid Caliph, except some of the family of the Abbasids had managed to escape and made their way to Cairo, where the Mamluks put them in ceremonial positions as Caliphs. They had titles, they had positions, but they had no power. The Mamluks made all the decisions. When Selim arrived, the last ceremonial caliph was a man called Al-Mutawakkil, and Selim forced him to relinquish his titles. Therefore, the Ottomans had gone from being the leaders of the Kai tribe to being beys of a beylik, princes of a principality, to sultans of an empire, to the Caesars of Rome, and finally the caliphs of the Muslim world, all within the space of 200 years. And the relics of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, were returning with Selim back to the city of Constantinople. Selim's capital city, Constantinople, was the most prestigious city in the world, and with his conquest of the Mamluks, he had taken control of Damascus, the former capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, and he'd also got his hands obviously on Cairo, the former capital of the Fatimid Caliphate. Within 5 years of coming to power, he had doubled the size of his empire, and he had made Constantinople the center of Sunni Islam. Selim's claim to being the Caliph lied with the fact that he controlled the most land, the most important cities, the key holy sites, and also he had the most military power. Now, according to classical Islamic jurisprudence, somebody becomes the Caliph when the people of power and influence in a society give them the Pledge of Allegiance. That didn't really occur with Selim, but in all reality, if Selim wasn't the Caliph, then who in the Muslim world was? He was obviously the top candidate. This is when the ulama, the religious establishment in Constantinople, started to write treatises to legitimize the role of Selim as the new Caliph of Islam, and also to remind him of his new duties, such as taking care of the Hajj pilgrimage and the pilgrims on their way to the Holy Lands. One of the most fascinating things about Selim was the combination of titles that he had. He had acquired the highest titles that a man could get in the Eastern world and the Western world. In the West, he had the title Qaisar Rum, Caesar of Rome, and in the East, he had the title of Caliph. And no man before in history had combined the two titles. And this sums up perfectly for me what the Ottoman Empire is. It's both Eastern and Western at the same time. A lot of Muslims look at the Ottoman Empire and think it was just an Eastern Empire, but they forget that Muhammad al-Fatih had styled the empire as the new Rome, but given Islam its living heartbeat. And many people in the West don't like the fact that a Muslim could be the Caesar of Rome. But in doing that, they forget that the title Caesar is not exclusively a Christian title. Initially, it was a pagan title. And they also forget that many of the people who were in the institutions of the Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries, the Viziers, and the scholars, were of European ethnicities from the Balkans. Selim the Grim was now the most powerful man in the world. And if his grandfather Muhammad al-Fatih was the man who fulfilled the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad by conquering Constantinople, he was the man who fulfilled the dream of the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Osman Ghazi, which was an empire that spanned over 3 continents. In Turkish, he's known as Selim Yavuz, which means Selim the Awesome or Selim the Great. But in English, he's known as Selim the Grim by his enemies because of the devastating defeats he inflicted upon them. In 1520, Selim the Grim, Selim Yavuz, became ill and he died. And he only had one son, so when he ascended the throne, there was no succession issues. Catholic Europe proclaimed the lion is dead and he has been replaced by a sheep.
Eleno. Del İslam el morto.
İslam'ın arslanı öldü, arslan gitti, kuzu geldi.
How wrong they were. Make sure you watch my next episode on the series of the Ottomans from Ertugrul to Ataturk. Salam.